The land agent laughed when Wren Callender laid her last $3 on the table, and he laughed because he thought he had sold a widow a mile of rope no one had dared touch in 30 years. She was 25 years old, widowed inside a single year, and she had been turned out of her husband's family house that same morning with $3 silver, a change of clothes rolled in a shawl, and her dead father's brass surveyor's compass, which was the one thing the Vanes had let her keep, because they judged it worthless. She had walked down from the high red rock country to the back tax sale in the county seat with no plan beyond, not weeping in front of them, and she had stood at the back of the crowded room while men in good coats bid on grazing sections and water rights in a foreclosed livery, and she had waited for the one lot she had come for, the lot she knew no one else would want. When the clerk called it, the room went quiet, that particular quiet a room falls into just before it laughs. Lot 41. One aerial ore tramway, so-called, a mile of iron cables strung on timber towers across the Chimney Rock Gorge, together with a control house and appurtenances thereto, condition unknown, no bidders of record in 30 years. And here is the thing I need you to carry with you before we go one step further into this canyon, because every single thing that happens tonight turns on it. Hanging dead center over that gorge, 100 feet and more above dry air, was one loaded ore bucket that no company man and no scavenger had ever once brought down. The cable had frozen with it out there the night the mine above shut. 30 years gone, and everyone who ever looked up at it decided it held nothing but the low-grade waste rock that wasn't worth the ride to fetch. They were wrong. What her father sealed inside that bucket, and what he braked into the little control house on the cliff's edge the last night of his life, would make this whole county take back every word it had ever said about him, and it would answer, in his own hand, the one question Wren had carried since girlhood and never once known how to ask out loud. Why would a man spend his life and his good name billing a line to haul ore, and then, the night he died, climb up alone and set the brake so that the one full bucket could never come down? Stay with me, because I mean to walk you clear out to the middle of the sky and back, and show you with my own words exactly what was inside. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. It matters more than you know that you are here. Now, the sale, Lot 41, the clerk said again, and cleared his throat, and did not quite meet anyone's eye. Do I hear a bid on Lot 41? Nobody moved. A man near the stove said something to the man beside him, and both of them looked back over their shoulders at her, at the plain young woman in the doorway in the butter-yellow dress, gone soft at the cuffs, with a deep red wool shawl held closed at her throat and a worn leather satchel over one shoulder, and they smiled that smile men wear when they are about to be unkind and want company for it. The land agent, whose name was Harlan Pruitt, and who had a soft pink face and a watch chain heavy as a trace, leaned back in his chair. $3, Wren said. Her voice came out steadier than she was. The room did laugh then, low and easy, a crowd laughing at a thing that costs it nothing. Pruitt let it run a moment before he lifted a hand. $3, he repeated, pleasantly, for the whole room. The lady bids $3 on the Widowmaker cable. He turned the words over like he was tasting them. Now, I'll speak plain with you. Because you seem a decent sort, and I'd not want it said Harlan Pruitt cheated a widow. That line up there is a clothesline for the devil. a mile of rope strung across a hole in the ground. It took 2 men in its working days, one off a tower in the wind, one when a bucket ran the brake, and it has taken nothing since but rust. Because no soul in this county has been fool enough to ride it in 30 years. You are not buying a business, ma'am. You are buying the privilege of being blamed for it when a tower finally comes down on somebody's cow. He spread his soft hands. So I'll ask you plain, ma'am, in front of these good men, and no shame in it. Do you want to withdraw the bid? No, Wren said. I want the deed. You understand what you're buying. I understand it better than you do, Mr. Pruitt. My father built it. The room went still at that, and a few of the men who had been smiling stopped. I know exactly what it is. $3. He looked at her a moment, and whatever he saw made him drop his eyes to the paper first. But it's a lawful bid, and I hear no other. $3. Sold to the lady, lot 41. The gavel came down like an afterthought. God help her, somebody added, and got his laugh. Wren walked to the front and laid the 3 coins on the table, one, and then the second, and then the third, and her hand did not shake doing it because she had learned in the last year exactly how much a person can hold still on the outside while everything inside her comes down. The clerk pushed a paper across to her, a receipt and a plat, and she folded it small and put it in the satchel beside the compass, and she went out into the hard, bright canyon morning before any of them could see her face do anything at all. I want to tell you plainly what had been taken from her, because the found things in this story only mean what they mean if you understand first how empty her hands were. A year before, Wren had been a bride. She had married Thomas Vane in the spring, a quiet man, a middle son, the least of a proud ranching family who held the good bottomland east of the county seat and never let anyone forget they held it. She had loved him in the plain, durable way you love a person who is kind to you when he does not have to be, and for 11 months she had kept his small house at the edge of the family land and learned to be looked through by his mother and measured by his brothers, and she had told herself it would soften with time. Then Thomas took a fever in the winter that would not break, and in 9 days he was gone, and the softening never came. What came instead was the reading of things. The land was entailed to the brothers, the house belonged to the family, there was no will because a middle son of 28 does not think to make one, and a childless widow of a year is, in the arithmetic of a proud family, a debt and not a daughter. They were not cruel to her the loud way, they were cruel the cold way, which is worse and leaves no marks to point to. His mother had the account books gone through. His eldest brother, Silas, sat her down at the kitchen table and explained it to her, not unkindly, in the voice a man uses to explain weather. "I'll not dress it up for you, Wren," he said. "The land's entailed. The house is the family's. There was no will, and the law is the law, and a woman of your sense knows there's nothing here for you now. We can see our way to $3 and your own effects. The sooner you're settled somewhere, the sooner we can all begin to heal. 11 months I kept his house," she said. "I sat up 9 nights with him. And we're grateful for it." He said it as if he were closing a ledger. But grateful isn't the same as owing, and there's no line in the books for a year. Then he had looked at the brass compass in her hands. She had taken it up off the shelf without thinking, as you might take up the hand of someone you miss. "You can have that old thing," Silas said. "It was only your father's. It's worth nothing." That was the wound, and I will not pretend it was the dead husband alone. It was the compass being called worthless by a man who did not know that the man who had carried it was the most careful, most laughed at, most quietly stubborn soul Wren had ever known. Because here is what the county said about her father, and what the Vanes said, and what Wren had spent her whole girlhood learning to hold her chin up against. Ezra Callender was the fool who built a road to nowhere. He was the surveyor who spent everything he had and everything he could borrow stringing an ore line across the Chimney Rock chasm to serve a silver mine on the far rim, and the mine had shut before his cable ever carried a full season's ore. And 2 men had died in the building and the running of it, and Ezra had died a poor and broken man in a shack on the canyon edge with nothing to leave his only child but a bad name and a length of rusting rope. That was the story. Everyone in the county knew the story. They had told it to Wren as a girl in the schoolyard, and they had told it to her again, gently, as a bride. So she would understand what family she came from and be grateful the Vanes had taken her at all. She had never once believed it. She could not have said why. She only knew that the man who came home smelling of cold iron and cable grease and penance smoke, who used to lift her up into an ore bucket when she was 6 and let her ride out over the empty air with his arm hard around her while she looked not down, but out at the far rim glowing gold in the last light, that man was not a fool. Fools do not check a thing 3 times. Fools do not keep a logbook in a hand so neat it looked printed. Fools do not light a lantern in a window every single dusk of their lives. Because that is the thing she remembered clearest of all, and I am going to ask you to hold on to it as she held on to it walking up out of that county seat with $3 gone to buy a mile of dead rope. Every evening of her childhood, at the exact moment the sun went off the far rim and the gorge filled up with blue shadow, her father had lit a lantern and set it in the west-facing window of the little control house on the cliff's edge. Not for light. There was light enough to see by. He lit it, he told her once, so that the line would know someone still kept it. She had been small enough then to think a cable could know a thing. She was old enough now to think it was the saddest sentence a lonely man had ever said. But she had never forgotten it, and could not have known, walking up out of that town, that the lantern was about to become the whole map of her life. She had nowhere else to go. That was the plain truth of it, and it is the truth that makes this a found structure story and not merely a sad one. She could not stay in the county seat where every second person knew her as the Callender girl the Vanes turned out. She had no family living. She had no money for a room past 2 nights and no trade a town wanted from a widow. But she owned, now, lawfully, a control house on a cliff, 4 walls, and a roof, however rotted, and it was hers, and no one living would follow her up there, because no one living wanted it. So she bought a sack of flour and a twist of salt and a tin of coffee with money she did not have. On a store credit the grocer extended her out of a pity she hated and needed. And she started up the long grade toward Chimney Rock in the afternoon, walking, because she had no horse, with everything she owned on her back and her father's compass warm in her hand. It was near dusk when she came up the last switchback and the gorge opened in front of her, and I want to slow down here, because this is the moment that decides whether a person can go on. The Chimney Rock Gorge is a wound in the earth, a sheer red-walled slot a 1/4 mile deep where some ancient river cut down through the sandstone and left the country standing on either side like two halves of a broken loaf. On the near rim, close enough to touch, stood the first timber tower, a great, leaning A-frame of squared timbers gone silver gray with 30 desert winters, canted over toward the drop as if it had grown tired of standing. From the top of it the cable ran out. She followed it with her eyes as you follow a thing you cannot believe, a single heavy strand of wire rope, thick as her wrist, sagging in a long, low curve, clear across the impossible open air of the gorge to a second tower she could just make out on the far wall. A mile away and half a mile down and up again, and hanging from that cable out over all that empty air, motionless, exactly where the world had left them 30 years ago, the buckets. Great weathered wooden ore buckets, iron-bound, 3 of them that she could count, hung dead still on their carriages in the last gold light, and the nearest one, and then the far ones. And dead in the center of the whole span, largest and stillest of all, one bucket hanging so far out over nothing that looking at it made her stomach drop, as though she stood on the edge herself. Oh, Wren said, out loud, to no one. That was all. Oh, because it was at once the most beautiful and most terrible thing she had ever seen. And it was hers. And it was. Exactly as Harlan Pruitt had promised her, a length of dead cable no one had dared to ride in 30 years, strung across a hole in the ground worth nothing at all. And she stood on the rim in the failing light with $3 gone and a dead man's name to defend, and no idea on earth what she had done. And for one long moment the whole weight of the year came down on her at once. And she thought, this is it. This is what I bought. This is all there is. I am going to tell you now that she was wrong, and that the being wrong is the whole of this story. But she did not know it yet. What she knew that first dusk was cold, and the smell of pinon smoke that was only memory, and a lit window promised 30 years dark. So she found the control house, and she went in. The control house was smaller than she remembered, as everything from childhood is smaller, and it was a wreck. It stood right on the lip of the cliff, a squat plank building bolted to the rock, one wall of it hanging out over the drop on great iron brackets so that the operator could lean out and watch a bucket run. The door hung on one hinge. The window that faced west, the lantern window, though she did not let herself think that yet was cracked in a long diagonal, but whole. Inside, everything was furred with 30 years of red dust and pack-rat nest. The roof had let water in along the low side, and the floor there had gone soft and black. A 3-legged stool lay on its side. A tin cup sat on the sill, filled to the brim with fine red dust, as if someone had set it down full of coffee and simply never come back. And along the whole cliffside wall stood the machine that had run the line, a great cast-iron drum wound with cable, a system of sheaves and pulleys gone orange and locked with rust, and rising up out of the middle of it, tall as her chest, a heavy iron brake lever. She stood in the doorway in the last of the light and looked at all of it, and the disappointment that came over her was so complete it was almost a relief, because at least it was a feeling she understood. This was it. This was the mighty inheritance the county had laughed at her for buying. A rotted shed on the edge of a cliff, full of rat dirt and rust. Over a canyon full of dead wooden boxes that would never move again. She had spent her last $3 and a store credit she could not repay to become the caretaker of a grave. Her father had died here alone, and now she would live here alone, and the only difference between them was that he had at least been a fool with a purpose, and she was only a widow with nowhere else to stand. She meant that first night to sell the cable. I will not soften that, because who a person is shows in what they mean to do before the story changes them. She sat on the floor of that ruined shed with her back against the cold iron drum, and she made the plain, sensible, defeated plan that any sensible, defeated person would make. There was money in the cable. Pruitt had set it himself. The syndicates bought old wire rope for scrap by the hundredweight. A mile of rusted cable, even so, was worth more melted down than she had paid for the whole lot. She would find a buyer. She would let them cut it down and haul it away. She would take the little money and go somewhere no one knew the name Callender, and she would let the county have the last laugh it had been wanting for 30 years. That was the plan. She even said it out loud, to the dark, to test whether she could bear it. "I'll sell the rope," she said. "I'll sell it and I'll go." And the shed did not answer, and the wind came up the gorge and moved something far out above the drop with a long, low iron groan, and she pulled the maroon shawl tighter and did not sleep. But in the gray before dawn, cold to the bone, she got up to find something to burn, and that was when the line told her its first thing. She went to the iron machinery in the half-light to see if any of the timber cribbing was dry enough to split for a fire, and her hand fell on the brake lever, and she stopped. Because the brake was set, not fallen, not rusted into any old position by chance set. Hard down and locked, with an iron pin driven through the keeper hole to hold it there. And the pin was seated clean and square by a hand that meant it, and around the whole assembly, under 30 years of dust, the metal was not the wild orange of neglect, but the darker, evener brown of iron that a careful person had greased and wiped down before they walked away. Someone had not fled this place. Someone had shut this line down as you close a good watch, deliberately, from the inside, and had driven a pin to hold the last full bucket where it hung, and had done it last, and then had gone. Wren knelt there in the cold with her hand on the brake, and felt the first thing she had felt in a year that was not grief. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing. It was the difference between abandoned and kept. And it went through her like the first swallow of hot coffee goes through a cold body, and she had no word for it yet, so she will let me give it to her. It was curiosity, and under the curiosity, so faint she would have denied it, it was hope. Because a fool does not set the brake and pin it and grease the drum on his way out of a failed life. A fool leaves the mess where it falls. Her father had shut this line down like a man locking something safe. She did not sell the cable. She stayed to fix one thing, as they always stay to fix one thing. And one thing became the rest of her life. Now I want to stay with you here at the seam of it, because this is where the story turns from a sad one into the other kind, and I do not want you to miss the turn. If you have felt, even once, that a thing you loved was called worthless by people who never troubled to understand it, stay with me, because Wren is about to start reading a dead man's real work, and it does not say what the county thinks it says. And if this is the kind of story you would want told slow and told all the way to the end, take a moment now to subscribe so the next one finds you. Now, the log book. She found it the second day, wrapped in oilcloth and wedged behind a loose board in the sill of the west window, dry as the day it was put there. It was her father's field logbook, and she knew his hand before she had the cover open, that neat, upright, printed-looking hand that no fool ever wrote in. She sat on the mended stool in the good light of the window and turned the pages. And at first her eyes filled, and she had to stop, because here was his life in pencil, dates and weather, and the plain daily accounting of a man who checked things 3 times. Cable tension by the season. The day the North Tower was trued. The names of the 2 men who died, each with a line under it she could not read twice. Corwin, off the tower, high wind, my fault for sending him. And later, alone, Bell, the runaway bucket, my fault for the break. He had carried them both. 30 years the county had called him careless, and here in his own careful pencil was a man who took every death onto himself and never once said so out loud. But it was the columns that stopped her. Because a tramway logbook, if it is what the county thought it was, is a record of tonnage, ore hauled, buckets run, weight moved, money made. And there was some of that in the early pages, the 2 thin seasons the mine had actually run. But page after that, years of pages, kept up long after the mine shut and the ore stopped, and any sane man would have walked away, were not tonnages at all. They were columns of numbers she half recognized and could not place. 3 figures to a line, degrees and minutes and a distance, over and over, shot toward the far wall and back again, in every season and every light. And she sat with them a long time in the window before the girl who had once ridden that cable with her father's arm around her understood what she was looking at. And when she understood it, the whole gorge tilted under her. They were survey bearings. Her father had not been running an ore line. He had been shooting the far rim over and over for 30 years, from the one place in 100 miles a man could reach at the dead center of the open air. You weren't hauling ore at all, she said aloud, to the empty shed, to the neat pencil hand, to him. You were measuring something. All this time you were measuring something, and nobody looked. I want to stop and stand in this canyon with you a moment, because the county's whole story of Ezra Callender was built on a thing that sounds like common sense, and common sense is where they went wrong. Everyone knew an aerial tramway was a machine for moving ore across ground a wagon could not cross. That much is true, and it is real history all through the mining West. From the 1870s on, men strung wire ropeways on timber towers across gorges no road could climb, buckets hung on a single running cable, a loaded bucket going down, hauling an empty one back up by its own weight. Through the brake gravity did the work, and a man at the drum did nothing but ride the brake lever and let the mountain lower its own ore. It was clever, and it was ordinary, and because it was ordinary, nobody looked twice at Ezra's line except to laugh that it served a mine gone bust. But a machine can be built for the ore and used for something else entirely. Wren's father had built a cargo line, yes, and then, once the ore ran out and the money ran out and the county had written him off, he had kept riding it for 30 years to the one place his whole life's work had really been aimed the far rim, half a mile out across the void that no wagon road on earth could reach. The tramway was never the point. The tramway was how he got to the point. She did not understand all of that at once. She got it as you get anything true, one rung at a time, and never the whole ladder in a night. The next rung was the compass. On the 3rd morning, she took her father's brass compass to the west window to clean the dust of years off its face, and holding it up to the light she saw, scratched into the wooden frame of the window itself, small and deliberate, worn shiny by a thumb that had touched it 10,000 times, a single line of figures. A bearing. 3 numbers, degrees and minutes, exactly in the hand of the logbook. She had passed it a dozen times and thought it a crack. Now she set the compass on the sill where the operator's stool stood, where her father had sat every working day of his life, and she sighted along the scratched bearing, and the needle swung and settled, and it pointed her eye straight out across the gorge. Straight along the cable, straight to the one full bucket hanging dead center over the void, and past it to a notch in the far rim she would never have picked out of the red rock in 100 years of looking. He had left himself a line. Every dusk, from that stool, he had checked that his aim still held. And she remembered, with the compass warm in her hand and her heart going hard, that he had told her once the lantern was so the crossing would know it had not been forgotten, and she thought for the first time that maybe he had not meant the cable at all. Maybe the line he kept was the bearing. Maybe the lantern in the window was how he told the far rim every single night that he had not given up on reaching it. She did not let herself finish the thought. It was too large, and she was not ready, and the dina of withholding is that a person turns away from the very thing they most want to know. So she went outside instead to walk off the pounding of it, and the canyon gave her the next rung. There was a path. Along the cliff edge from the control house, out to the base of the near tower, and around it, worn into the very rock, not a game trail. Not a thing the wind made, but a path, beaten by one pair of boots going the same way 10,000 times. It ran to a little bench in the stone under the tower where a man could sit and watch the whole span, and there was a stub of candle there in a tin, and the tin was not 30 years rusted, and Wren stood over it with the wind in her loosened braid, and understood that her father had not built this line, and lost it, and died broken. He had built it, and lost the ore, and then he had come out here to this bench nearly every dusk for the rest of his life to sit and study the far wall and light the lamp and keep the bearing for 30 years alone, while the county laughed. It was the most stubborn and the loneliest and the least foolish thing she had ever heard of a person doing, and it was her father. And something in her that the veins had spent a year freezing broke open and ran warm. "You came out here every night," she said to the empty bench, to the stub of candle in its tin. "They laughed at you the whole time, and you came out here every night, and you kept your aim." Well, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "I'm here now. Show me the rest of it." That was the night she decided she was not going to sell the rope. She was going to bring the bucket down. Now understand plainly what that meant, because I will not have you thinking a widow simply threw a switch. The line was 30 years dead. The sheaves were seized with rust, the drum was frozen, the brake was pinned, and the one loaded bucket hung 140 feet out over dry air on a cable no one had trusted their weight to since 2 men died on it. To bring it down, she would have to make a dead machine live, alone, with no money and no help, in a country that would have paid to watch her fail. And she did it the only way such a thing is ever done, one seized sheave at a time, over weeks. With lamp oil and lard and vinegar and a patience she had learned holding still at the veins' cold table. She freed the pulleys. She greased the drum. She replaced the rotted brake blocks with hardwood she split, and shaped herself by the logbook's own drawings, because her father, being who he was, had left the drawings. She tested the brake against a stone, and then against a half-load of sand, and then, her heart in her throat, against nothing but the empty carriages, easing them down the near cable and back a foot at a time, learning the weight of the mountain in her 2 hands on the lever. And on a bright, hard morning near the middle of that autumn, with the blue sky over the red rock and the light coming clean and level across the gorge, she stood at the drum in her father's control house, and she knocked the iron pin out of the keeper, and she took the brake lever in both hands, and she brought the sealed bucket in off the cable. It came slow. It came with a groan of iron 30 years in the making, and a fine rain of rust off the cable and the whole tower singing under the load, and Wren rode the brake as he had taught her small hands to ride it, out over that terrible open air, letting the mountain lower its own weight until the great weathered bucket swung in over the rim and settled onto the timber, landing with a sound like a... Coffin sat down gentle and stopped and was still, and she stood over it shaking in the sudden enormous quiet, and she saw that it was not full of low-grade ore at all. The county had been wrong about that, too. It was sealed. The plank lid was pitched down tight all around with tar gone hard as stone, sealed by a careful hand against 30 years of weather, and set into the lid. Under the pitch was a small brass plate her father had let into the wood, and stamped into the plate, in the hand she now knew better than her own, were 3 words, for the keeper. She did not open it that day. Sit with that a moment, because it is the truest thing about her. She had brought down out of the high air the sealed thing her father had died protecting, the thing that would answer the question of her whole life, and it sat on the landing an arm's length away, and she covered it with her shawl and left it sealed, because some part of her already knew, as the cabin folk in these stories always already know, that once she read what was inside there would be no more of him left to find, and she was not ready to come to the end of her father. So she waited 3 days. She kept the line greased, and she lit the lantern at dusk, and she let the bucket sit sealed, and on the 3rd evening, when she could not bear the not knowing a moment longer, she took her father's own chisel, and she broke the pitch and lifted the lid. Inside there was no ore. There was a fitted wooden case, oilcloth wrapped, dry as bone. And Wren lifted it out with both hands and carried it into the control house and set it on the sill in the failing light and opened it. And what was inside was paper. It was her father's true work, 30 years of it, and I will tell you what it physically was, because the object comes now, but I am not going to say yet what it meant. Because the meaning is the thing he braked into the sky to keep, and it does not land until the end, and I will not cheat you of it. It was a survey, a complete, finished, beautifully drawn survey of the far rim, the notch the bearing pointed to, and the whole bench of country beyond it that no wagon road could climb and no man in the county had set foot on in living memory. Page after page in that neat, upright hand, elevations, water, soil, a spring marked and measured and named, grazing enough for 100 head, a whole hidden shelf of good high country that everyone had assumed was more of the same worthless red rock because there was no way to get to it to know. Her father had gotten to it. From the middle of the sky, dusk after dusk for 30 years, he had shot and checked and drawn the one piece of the county nobody else could reach. And he had sealed the finished work in a bucket over the void where no thief would ever think to look, and he had braked it there and lit a lamp against the dark so the crossing would know it was still tended. And under the survey, tied in oilcloth of its own, was a sealed letter, and on the outside of it, in his hand, it said, "For the one steady enough to bring it home, not to be opened until the line is worked again." Wren held that letter a long time and did not open it. The line had only just been worked again, that very autumn, by her own 2 hands. She had earned the right to it. And still she set it back in the case, because she understood now what her father had understood, that a thing kept is worth more than a thing spent, and that she wanted, for one more little while, to be a daughter who still had one last unopened word from him waiting. She did not get the while she wanted, because on the morning of the fourth day the wagon came up the grade in a way she would remember all her life, and it was not a truck, of course. This being 1886, it was a heavy freight wagon and men, and Harlan Pruitt riding up front in his good coat with a paper in his hand. And behind him a hard-faced foreman and a crew of 6 with cold chisels and block and tackle and a great iron cable cutter on a cart come to take her line down for scrap. Stay with me now, because everything her father built and everything she rebuilt is about to stand or fall in one afternoon, and I promise you it turns on a thing you will not see coming. If you have made it this far into the story, you already know these two people are not evenly matched, a widow alone against a land agent and a paid crew and a paper with a seal on it. Take one moment to subscribe before the paper comes out so you are here for how she answers it. Now, the writ. "Morning," Pruitt said, climbing down, pink and pleasant as ever, and he did not offer his hand. "I'll not pretend to be glad it's you, ma'am, but business is business, and you'll want to hear it from me plain rather than from the sheriff." He held up the paper. "This here's a writ of salvage and condemnation, filed lawful and granted, out of the district court. The Cordova Scrap and Iron Syndicate has bought the salvage rights to all abandoned mine works in this district, and a condemnation on any structure declared a public danger. Your line qualifies twice over. It's abandoned within the meaning of the statute, it's been abandoned 30 years, and it's a danger to life. You'll recall I said as much the day you bought it. So we're going to cut it down and haul it out for the iron, and I'm sorry for it, but the county will thank us, and you'll be paid the scrap value of your $3 lot, which is more than you gave. You might even come out ahead." He almost looked kind saying it. "It was always going to end this way, ma'am. You bought a grave. We've come to fill it in." And there it was, the exact erasure her father had braked the line to prevent. Not a thief after the gold, because there was no gold. Something worse and more final. Men who would cut the cable down for the weight of its iron and haul the whole thing away, towers, buckets, drum and brake, and leave nothing standing on the rim at all, so that the one road to the far country was gone for good, and the far country went back to being the worthless red rock everyone believed it was. Ezra Callender had not sealed the survey against a burglar. He had sealed it against exactly this, against the day the county's own indifference came with a writ and a cable cutter to erase the thing he'd given his life to reach. She saw it whole in that moment, and the seeing of it steadied her more than any anger could have. The foreman was already walking his men toward the near tower. Wren stepped in front of them. "You'll want to read your own paper again," she said. Pruitt smiled the patient smile. "I wrote half of it, ma'am. Then you'll know what it turns on." Her voice was very quiet, and it did not shake. "You said it twice. The writ takes an abandoned line, a line no one has worked. That's the whole of your claim, that this is a dead thing no living hand keeps." She looked past him, out at the span, at the empty carriages hanging clean and greased on a cable that no longer wept rust. "Send your man out on it, Mr. Pruitt. Send him to the middle and back out and home as I go every morning. If the sheaves are seized and the brake is dead and no one has worked this line in 30 years, he'll not be able to move a bucket a foot. And you can cut it down with my blessing and the court's." She took the iron pin from her pocket, the pin that pinned the brake, worn bright now from her own hand. But if it runs, if a bucket goes out loaded and comes back as it did this autumn, worked, kept, alive, then your writ has no line to stand on, because you cannot condemn as abandoned to works that a keeper is working. And I have a logbook with this season's entries in a dead man's daughter's hand to prove I've kept it, and the whole county saw the smoke of my fire on this rim all fall to say I've lived here and run it. Read your paper, sir. It beats itself. Pruitt's pleasant face did a thing then that was almost worth the whole year to see. It did not go angry. It went uncertain, which, on a man like Pruitt, is a rarer sight. It's a technicality, he said, but the ease had gone out of his voice. A cable a woman greases of a morning is not a working tramway. No reasonable man would call this a going concern. No reasonable man wrote it this autumn either, Wren said. I did. The statute doesn't ask whether it's a going concern, Mr. Pruitt. It asks whether it's abandoned. Read the word. I know what the word says. I wrote the word. Then you know it undoes you. She did not raise her voice. Abandoned means no one keeps it. I keep it. You cannot cut down for scrap a line that a living hand still works, and you have 8 witnesses who are about to watch me work it. He looked down at the writ in his own hand, the writ he had helped draw, and he read it, and his soft mouth moved as he came to the word he himself had leaned on abandoned, because he knew, as a man who deals in paper always knows, that she had it exactly right. The Cordova Syndicate's whole claim, the condemnation and the salvage both, rested on the single load-bearing lie that this was a dead and masterless thing. A right-of-way across public land does not belong to whoever wants the iron. It belongs, in the plain language of the statute he had cited, to whoever holds and works the line, and it lapses to salvage only when the line is truly abandoned. Worked by no one, kept by no one, dead, Ezra Callender had worked it to his last dusk. And his daughter, God help her, as the man himself had said, had brought it back to life with her own 2 hands, in plain sight of the whole county, and had the log and the greased cable and the ash of her fires to prove it. The foreman looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the span, at the clean carriages, at the young woman standing in front of his crew with an iron pin in her fist and no fear left in her face at all. And then, because he was a businessman and not a brute, and because a syndicate does not pay to lose a lawsuit it has already lost on the page, he folded the writ. Run it, he said to the foreman. If she can run it, we've no claim, and I'll not have Cordova hauled into court to be told so. The foreman hesitated, and if she drops a bucket in the trying, then that's her affair and not ours, Pruitt said, and we'll have our answer either way. Let her run it. And Wren went out to the drum, and she knocked the pin and took the lever in both hands. And she sent an empty bucket out across the gorge to the dead center of the span and brought it home clean and slow and sure, while 8 men stood on the rim and watched a deadline live. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the foreman, an older man with a canyon face, took his hat off, which is not nothing from a man like that, and put it back on, and told his crew to load the cutter back on the cart. I want you to notice what did not happen here, because it is the whole soul of this kind of story and a place where the lesser ones go wrong. Wren did not gloat. She did not make a speech. She did not ruin Harlan Pruitt or run him off the rim or make him crawl, though she surely wanted to and had cause. She beat him with his own paper and her own labor and the plain fact of the work, and then she let him fold his writ and drive his wagon back down the grade with what was left of his dignity. Because a person who has been made small does not need to make someone else small to feel tall again. She just needed her father's line to stand. It stood. That was enough. The men went down the grade, and the dust settled, and the gorge was hers, and quiet, and she was alone on the rim in the long gold evening with a letter she had earned the right to open. She opened it that night, by the lantern in the west window. I have kept it from you all this way, the meaning of it, because he kept it from the world all his life. And I wanted you to come to it as she did, having done the work first, having earned the word. So here is what Ezra Callender wrote, in that neat upright hand, to whoever proves steady enough to carry his work down out of the sky. He wrote that he had built the line for the oar, and lost the oar, and been called a fool, and that he had made his peace with the fool part years ago because the fool part was true. He had bet his life and 2 other men's on a mine that failed, and he carried Corwin and Bell every day and would to the end. But he wrote that in the losing of it he had seen a thing no one else could see, because no one else could get out above the open gorge to look, that the far rim, the worthless red rock everyone dismissed for the plain reason that no one could reach it, was not worthless at all. There was a spring up there that ran all year. There was grass and shelter and good high country enough to keep a family alive through any drought the low country ever threw. It was the best land in the county, and it might as well have been on the moon, because the only road to it was a mile of cable strung 100 feet and more over dry air, and no sane man would build such a road on purpose. But he had already built it by accident for the ore. So he spent the rest of his life finishing the survey that would let it be claimed, and worked and lived on. And he filed it, and here Wren had to stop and read the line 3 times. He filed it in her name, years ago, when she was still a girl riding out beside him with his arm around her, looking not down, but out. He had claimed the far rim for his daughter before she was old enough to know what a claim was, and he had sealed the proof in the sky. And he had kept the lantern burning against the dark, waiting for the day she would need it and be strong enough to come and bring it home. And then, at the bottom, he had written the thing that was not about land at all. And it is the thing I want to leave in your hands tonight. He could have hidden it, he said, in a bank or a lawyer's box where any thief with a key could take it. He put it in the sky instead, behind a mile of iron cable and a brake, because he did not want the one who found it to be whoever was cleverest or richest or quickest. He wanted it to be the one who was steadiest, the one who could learn a dead machine and trust it with her own weight and ride out across the drop and not look down. In all his years, he wrote, he had only ever known one person like that. You were 6 years old, he wrote, and I lifted you into the bucket, and I was more afraid than you were, and you did not look down. You looked out. You have looked out your whole life, at the far thing, the hard-to-reach thing, and never once at the drop. That is why the line is yours. Not because you are my blood, because you are the keeper. I knew it before you could spell the word. Light the lamp, Wren. Let the line know someone still keeps it. Wren sat a long time in the window with the letter in her lap and the gorge going blue and then black outside, and she did not weep as you might think. She had done her weeping the cold way, at the Vanes table over a year that took everything. This was the other kind, the warm kind, the kind that comes when a thing you were told your whole life was worthless turns out to have been the most valuable thing there ever was, and to have been yours all along, and to have been waiting. The ore was never the treasure. The land even, the good high country, and the year-round spring was not quite the treasure, though it would keep her the rest of her days. The treasure was that her careful, laughed-at, unfoolish father had looked at every person he ever knew, and chosen her the child who rode out over nothing, and looked at the far rim instead of the fault, and had trusted her, years before she could have earned it, to be the one steady enough to bring it home. She belonged to something after all. She had this whole time been someone's chosen keeper, and the county that turned her out and the family that called her a debt had never once known that the widow with $3 was the richest person on the rim. So she lit the lamp. She trimmed the old wick and filled it from her own tin of oil, and she set it in the west window at the exact moment the sun left the high far wall, and the canyon filled up with blue, as he had done every dusk of her childhood, as he had done for 30 years alone, so the line would know someone still kept it. And the small, warm light spilled out over the void and touched the near cable and lost itself in the enormous dark of the gorge. And a mile off and half a mile down and up again, the far country her father had spent his life reaching held the last of the sun a moment longer than the rest of the world, as high places do, as if it knew. The rest came as the good endings always come slow, and without triumph, and better than a triumph. Wren proved the survey and the claim, and it held, because a dead man's careful work in his living daughter's hand is a hard thing for any court to turn away. She worked the line. She learned to run a loaded bucket clear across the span and land it soft. And she carried up timber and seed and a bred heifer and a second lantern, and by the next autumn there was a cabin on the high country nobody had reached in a generation, with a spring that ran all year and smoke in the evening and a light in the window. But she did not keep it for herself the greedy way, and this is the last thing I want you to know about her. There came a dry year, as there always does in that country, when the low creeks failed and the low families had no water and no high grass to move their stock to, and Wren opened the far rim to them. She ran their cattle up the tramway a bucket at a time, and their children rode out over the open air with her arm around them, more afraid than she was, and she taught them not to look down, but out. She took no toll for it. When the first of the low ranchers stood on her rim with his hat in his hands, ashamed to ask, and offered to pay whatever she named, she only shook her head. There's no charge for the crossing, she told him. My father built it to reach a hard place in a dry year. This is the dry year. Bring your stock up at dawn. They said your daddy was a fool, the man said, not unkindly, wondering at it. They said a great many things, Wren answered. Bring your stock up at dawn. She had learned the price of being made to feel worthless, and she would not put that price on anyone. The county that had laughed at Ezra Callender for 30 years came, in the end, to send its children and its cattle across his impossible cable to the only high water in a drought, and to speak his name the other way, and Wren never once said I told you so, because the ones who have really been vindicated never need to. Harlan Pruitt, they say, tipped his hat to her on the county road one day near the end, and she tipped hers back, and that was all, and it was enough. She kept one thing to herself, and she keeps it still. In the very last of the logbook, in her father's hand, below the final survey bearing, there is one more line of figures, a second bearing, off from the first, aimed at nothing she has ever been able to find on the far rim or anywhere else. She has sighted it 100 times from the operator's stool. She does not know what it points to. She has decided she does not need to. A father is allowed to keep one secret from a daughter, as a daughter is allowed to keep one from a county. And some things are better as a light you tend than a question you answer. So she leaves it be. She works the line. And every single dusk, when the sun leaves the high rock and the canyon fills with blue, she lights the lamp and sets it in the window facing west so the crossing will know it is still held. Because that was the whole of it, in the end, under the oar and under the land and under the survey, sealed in the sky. The treasure was never the thing everyone could see and everyone dismissed. It was the reach, the long, stubborn faith it takes to build a road to a place the world swears is worthless, and to keep it alone in the dark, on nothing but the belief that someone steady enough will one day come and bring it home. Her father had that faith for 30 years with no proof it would ever be answered. And it was answered. It was answered by the one person he chose, the child who never looked down. If there is a far rim in your own life, some hard-to-reach thing, some person, some worth in yourself that the whole county has told you isn't there, I hope this story sits with you tonight. And I would like to know, before you go, is the thing you are keeping the lamp lit for a place you are still trying to reach, or a person you are waiting to come home? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one, and I will be here, keeping the light in the window against the dark. Thank you for riding out over the void with me tonight. Sleep well.